Welcome to CRJ 151. This week we're looking at Chapter 13 and 14. Chapter 13 explores the connection between drugs and crime, whereas Chapter 14 looks at the illicit drug industry. So, starting with Chapter 13, when we look at drug use and crime and violence, they are very strongly related to each other. But the question is, do the direct pharmacological effects of drugs cause criminal violent behavior? As many observers have argued for more than a century, or is the link more indirect? Is it mediated by the influence of some third or even fourth factor or variable? Now, numerous drug experts have offered one or other explanation for the mechanism of the link, which includes what they call the enslavement model, which usually calls for the legalization of drugs. There's also the predisposition model, which argues that illicit drug users are the types of people who are also likely to commit crimes even before they become involved in drug use. And then there's the intensification model, which argues that drug use drives crime. Now, researchers have also proposed three models to explain the drug use violence nexus, which includes one that argues that the influence of direct pharmacological effects. There's also one that argues the need to earn money to support a habit that really drives the addict and the abuser into violent behavior. And then the systemic model, which is one that argues that compulsive drug use really impels the abuser into a world in which violence is not only common, but it's really necessary for survival. So most observers will argue that the systemic model offers probably the most complete and valid picture of crime and violence. Now, sometime before the 1970s, researchers argued that heroin addicts committed fewer crimes of violence than non-addict criminals. But starting in the 1970s, that picture kind of changed. Violence among addicts increased sharply and dramatically. And so current observers argue that the reason for this discrepancy was partly due to the fact that early researchers argued that violence was lower among addicts because of the direct pharmacological effects of opiates. In other words, they were more calming. And also partly that addict violence really did increase in the 1970s, and partly because the post-1970s addicts became polydrug users. In other words, they used many drugs, and they added drugs such as cocaine to their drug use repertoire. Now, alcohol is a drug, and its use is closely related to violent behavior. Now, although most acts of alcohol consumption don't entail violence, most of the time that criminally violent behavior occurs, alcohol intoxication is a factor in that type of crime. Now, the same applies to victims of violence. There are some observers that argue for the influence of cultural norms in this process, and some argue for the direct pharmacological effect of alcohol. Now, probably in reality, both factors play a role, but alcohol is most certainly directly causally implicated in the occurrence of criminal violence. Now, Chapter 14, looking at the illicit drug industry, you really can't have a discussion of this without an examination of drug trafficking. So most discussions of drug use focus mainly on the predisposition to use psychoactive substances. However, the availability, the enterprise that produces the substance and then delivers it into the hands of the ultimate user is also a necessary precondition for use. So illicit drug distribution really comprises a huge industry, although it is on the decline. Now, Americans spend tens of billions of dollars on illegal drugs, roughly half of which is on cocaine. So trafficking is really a kind of a magnet for myths and stereotypes. One of these is the centralization of the trade, such as a single Mr. Big who controls the whole market. That is just not true. Now, although some drug markets are fairly centralized, the illicit drug trade, taken as a whole, is really diverse. It involves a score of substances, a lot of different source countries, and tens of thousands of producers, smugglers, and distributors that are up and down the supply chain. Most of those are loosely and temporarily connected. Take, for example, roughly half of the marijuana consumed in the United States is grown domestically, and then the growers tend to be separate and independent entrepreneurs. Now, another myth related to drug trade as an economic liability is that to determine its economic impact, you also have to subtract from it the gross domestic product. So when you look at that, the drug trade actually is an integral component of the economic picture. In other words, it provides jobs, expenditures, and kind of it has a ripple effect on the economy. So as economic products, really, drugs can be divided into three categories. Those that conform to the pure agricultural model, which is like marijuana and opium. Those are the pure chemicals, such as ecstasy and LSD. And then there's the mixed models, which would be heroin and cocaine. Now today, heroin that's sold on the streets of the United States is derived mainly from South America, though it also tends to be imported to the U.S. by Mexican nationals in the West, or on the West Coast, and then Dominicans on the East Coast. Now, in contrast, heroin that's consumed in other parts of the world, in particularly Europe, really comes from Afghanistan. Now, nearly all cocaine use worldwide derives from the coca plants grown in three countries, which is Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia. Now, methamphetamines used to be manufactured in the U.S., but now it's mainly imported from Mexico. Now, a key factor here is globalization, which is probably the most important factor in expanding the scope and the size of the drug industry. When you look at this contact, with other countries all over the globe that permits certain illicit substances to be produced and distributed and then used by addicts and abusers in the United States. That's probably not going to change in the foreseeable future. Now, observers and critics have argued that the American drug enterprise harms source countries. In many respects, that is true. However, another thing to look at is, if the illicit drug trade were wiped out overnight, these countries would be plunged into poverty more dire than what is currently prevailing there. So the illicit drug trade does pose a painful dilemma that really remains insoluble at this time and probably for some time to come. Now, next time we'll look at Chapter 15, which explores law enforcement, drug courts, and drug treatment.